Configuring Azure Active Directory authentication for Azure SQL Scale-Out is a crucial step in securing your database and ensuring seamless access for authorized users. This tutorial will guide you through the process step by step. First, you need to create an Azure Active Directory and register your Azure SQL Server. To do this, navigate to the Azure portal and select Azure Active Directory from the navigation menu. Create a new directory or use an existing one. Then, register your Azure SQL Server by selecting SQL Servers from the navigation menu, choosing your server, and clicking on Active Directory Admin. Next, you need to configure the Azure Active Directory authentication. To do this, select the Azure SQL Server and click on Active Directory Admin. Then select Set Admin. Choose the Azure Active Directory you created earlier and select a user or group to be the administrator. Now, you need to create a new user in Azure Active Directory to use for authentication. To do this, navigate to the Azure Active Directory Users and Groups page and click on New User. Fill in the required information and create the user. After creating the user, you need to grant the necessary permissions to the user. To do this, navigate to the Azure SQL Server and click on SQL Databases. Then select the database you want to grant access to. Click on Query Editor and execute the necessary SQL commands to grant the required permissions to the user. To connect to the Azure SQL database using Azure Active Directory authentication, you need to use the correct connection string. The connection string should include the Azure Active Directory authentication details, such as the tenant ID and client ID. Best practices for configuring Azure Active Directory authentication for Azure SQL Scale-Out include using least privilege access, regularly reviewing and updating permissions, and using Azure Active Directory groups to manage access to the database. It is also recommended to use multi-factor authentication to add an extra layer of security. In conclusion, configuring Azure Active Directory authentication for Azure SQL Scale-Out is a straightforward process that requires creating an Azure Active Directory, registering your Azure SQL Server, configuring Azure Active Directory authentication, creating a new user, granting necessary permissions, and using the correct connection string. By following these steps and best practices, you can ensure secure and seamless access to your Azure SQL database.